Greetings in the name of the Lord. Welcome. Grace be with you. Peace, shalom, whatever greeting works. I am Cullen Cressman, and this is my attempt at a podcast. Greetings. I am going to talk today about Noah, but before I get into that, I want to address a question. I was happy to see a question, but I also kind of expected it. A little bit of clickbait, if you will, about the Nephilim. And so I was glad to receive a question, but want to give some clarification on what I'm referring to about the Nephilim. In the story, the beginning of chapter 6, Genesis 6, you have kind of the setup, which we need to talk about today anyways to discuss Noah. But to give clarification on the Nephilim, there are ideas that the reference to the sons of God are a certain type of angelic being. And so you have angelic beings or a supernatural being, if you will, that is having relations with humans and then are producing kind of a hybrid, the Nephilim, the giants, these men of renown. What I am saying is that I do not believe that those references are to a supernatural type of being. The reference, and I'll explain that with the terms, sons of God, son of God, is actually a term that can be used for angels in the Old Testament, but it is also used of the people of God, the people groups. And so I think that this is an important reference because this is at least indicating something that belongs to or is supposed to belong to God. It is people, the sons of God, that are outside of the will of God, which contributes to the flood, in my views, at least what I will lay out here in a little bit with Noah. But the Nephilim are actually as a not really a people group, but as a type of person, I guess you could say, are mentioned in Numbers, but it's just within a catch-all of people. It's not a reference to a super being or a supernatural type of individual, and so it doesn't seem, we don't have any kind of reference throughout Scripture that's supposed to be warning us or giving us this idea of angels mating with humans and things like that. So what I want to clarify is it seems that the Son of God reference that would produce the Nephilim, the reason I'm saying the Nephilim I do not believe are supernatural is because I do not believe the reference to being sons of God is a reference to an angelic thing. Okay, so now that that's clarified, what I want to focus in here is about Noah. And so I do want to discuss the opening of chapter 6 and kind of the purpose of the flood. And in order to do that, I want you to first look at, go ahead and read everything up to chapter 11, Genesis chapter 11. And so if you read, you have the genealogy that leads from Adam to Noah. It's a very important thing. And then after the flood narrative, you have a genealogy that goes from Noah to Abraham. And so Abraham is the covenant bearer, so to speak, the one that is the one carrying the covenant made with humans that is going to be for salvation. And so you have a covenant with Noah, but the covenant with Noah is kind of like a promise, not that evil things will not happen. But the covenant with Abraham is about salvation, so to speak. And so you have what's going on here in the narrative, and I talked in the last episode about narrative time. And so what I want to discuss here is about narrative arrangement and focus. And that is, you have this speeding up, this quick thing going on with the time, but you also have focusing in. The genealogies within the are being used as a literary device, so to speak, to focus us in on different stories, and they're really jumping us from one to the next. So you have from Adam to Noah, then from Noah to Abraham, and that gives us the staircase, so to speak, the pieces to get to the important things in the narrative. And so the reason I say that is because I'm not going to spend time on different pieces of stuff. As I mentioned at the beginning of this dive into Genesis, I'm not looking at apologetic things, but I'm wanting to look at the narrative. So if the narrative is speeding us through these things to get to Noah, that's what I'm wanting to focus in on. Now, that the reason I want to view it that way is because you have narrative place, a arrangement, so to speak, of how the story works through the point A to point B, and then also how this genealogy actually creates a bookend. And so you have a narrative device that's used in a lot of literature, even today, but especially in ancient literature, that's called a chiasm or a chiasm, however you want to pronounce it. But the way the device works is that you have bookends, you have a similar and a lot of times identical item, theme or a motif, or even a specific word that is said that is on two ends of a story. And then within those 2 points, you'll have another. Okay, so actually probably what will be, look at this, I'm actually doing a video, so this would be helpful for everybody. I will go ahead and draw this so you can see how this works. So you'd have a bookend, and that bookend will actually have similar points. So in our scenario here, you would have A and A. Okay, so on the 2 outside points. And the A in this situation would be the genealogies. But then you would have other parallels, other things that are going on, and this is the way that it's presented when you're studying it, at least if you're studying a chiasm. And so when you're looking at it, you'll have all these similarities, and they can drill down pretty significantly. But this is how it would be presented if you're looking at it in an academic fashion, if you're doing a study of stuff. And that would be that you have these bookends that follow, A, B, C, D, and then you get to the heart of the story at E. And again, different narratives have different arrangements. So one of the things I want you to do right now, while we're just discussing this literary device, this way of presenting a narrative, is actually go read from the genealogy. So those are your 2 bookends. You have the genealogy on one side of Noah and a genealogy on the other side of the Noah story. Those are your A's. Those are your bookends. Now, kind of take a bird's eye view of the story. Don't be focusing in so much on the chronology of the story, but take a bird's eye view of the story and see what patterns are similar. Okay, so you have, for example, off the top of my head, I can think of the Lord telling Noah to go into the ark with his wife and his sons' wives. And then at the other end of the story, he says to go out of the ark with his wife and his sons. Okay, so you have these, that's another section, so to speak. You have all kinds of references to time. So 7 days, they're in the boat 7 days before the flood starts. They're in the boat 7 days before they get out of the boat. So there's these parallels that are going on, and they funnel in, and that's a chiasm. That's the way that the narrative is taking shape. Now, what I'm wanting to do, try to help us here in this podcast, is I'm wanting to get kind of drill down to some finer points within the story itself, not get distracted by outside things. But there are some things to discuss and to consider culturally. So one of the things that I think is very cool is that you do have other flood narratives. You have other civilizations, other ancient texts that we have that have flood narratives. And that is an important thing because it actually gives us a continuity, a something that we can say this isn't just a phenomenon within Scripture, but we actually can say that this is something that was a type of global event, something that people observed in other cultures outside of Israel. That's a very important thing for evidence. But another thing that's important about those other flood narratives is the same way that I had talked about Genesis chapter 1, is when you compare these different narratives and you see the reasons, or you see the ways that the gods act within the story. It's very different from the way that God acts with Noah. So Noah is not saved because he has some kind of special craft that's going to be used to reinstate civilization. It's because he's righteous. That's what the Lord has seen, his righteousness. That's something that's important. Okay, so that's a difference within the story. Another thing is that that God is not scared of the flood. It actually is very obvious, at least to me, when you're reading through the flood narrative, that God is the one that's in charge of when the flood happens and takes place. He's not running from it. He's not worried about it. And it's not something that was done. This is another comparative thing. It's not something that was done because the world was getting too populated, too big. You see that in the affirmation after the flood is over, that the Lord tells Noah to go and multiply, to have kids, to go and fill the earth. And so this is not, again, you have these comparisons going on with other cultures that really highlight the difference in the God that's in the Bible. And when you see those things that are similar, they have similarities, but they are different. And those differences are important because it nuances it. It gives us a fresh view of what our God is like. And so that's an important thing to know. So that's outside. And you have some narrative things going on that really help you funnel in. And so pause right now, go look at those genealogies and see what you can find looking in there, and take some guesses at what you would consider the middle point. What would be the heart of the passage? In that diagram, even draw it out in a diagram, write down some verses if you want to. And then come back and I'll continue my talk here about Noah. So one of the things that I find fascinating about the story of Noah is kind of the what's the reason for it? What's the purpose behind it? And this is where I wrestle with the goal of narratives, the purpose of narratives. So when you're reading through a narrative, you have to understand that a lot of times the writer is not concerned with the things you're concerned with. And that's one of the things that's a very difficult commitment in my life. My commitment to the Bible is that I want to concern myself with the things that the Bible concerns itself with. I want to focus on the things the Bible focuses on. And it seems when you're reading Genesis, I mean, you can just tell by the space that it's given. Okay, so if you get to Genesis chapter 12, which we'll get there in a couple of episodes, you get to Genesis chapter 12, and it's all about Abraham, and Abraham is the guy for the people of Israel. That is the origin. Okay, so it seems that everything else up to this point is the preface of the book, I guess you could say, it's the thing that's just getting us there. And so that frustrates me so much because I want to concern myself with the things that the Bible's concerned with, and it seems the Bible is most concerned in Genesis with getting to Abraham. But it's giving us the needed context to get there to Abraham. And so at times it's moving so fast, and that's kind of the best answer I can give right now. It's moving so fast that it doesn't answer all the questions that I want it to answer. It doesn't satisfy certain interests that I have. And so I'm left, I've used this analogy a couple of times, but I'm left with wrestling with these stories. What do they mean? What am I supposed to take away from this? And so one of the things that I wrestle with when in the story of Noah is I'm trying to figure out what in the world, what is going on here that has grieved the Lord so much that he would wipe out the creation. And all of the awful things that I see in our world today, in our society today, I'm kind of asking, well, how come it's not happening again? And so this story of Noah answers some things, but then other things I'm left struggling with, left wrestling and trying to figure out. So I want to just dive into that for a little bit. One of the things that is interesting to me is we're talking about previously. I was talking about the Nephilim, these men of renown, but the thing that produced the Nephilim is a disobedience. I guess the best I could say would be a disobedience. And it's kind of like, well, why wouldn't the Lord have wiped out everybody when Cain murdered Abel? But it seems like there's a twisting, so to speak, of the fundamental nature of humans. And what I mean by that is I want to read to you chapter 6. It says that the sons of God, chapter 6, verse 2, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took them as their wives any they chose. And they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever. For he is flesh, his day shall be 120 years. 120 years, by the way, is a reference. It's used in other places culturally in the ancient Near East. That's kind of your reference of like, this is the longest a human could possibly live. And so it's more God saying that this is mortality. My spirit shall not abide in man forever. And this is an indication. It says, then the Lord said. So he's grieved at this. He's upset with this. Then another thing that I think is important is there's a reference to violence. So if you skip down to verse 11, this is after Noah has been identified, but verse 11 it says, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And I'm wondering how these things go together, of that they took women as they chose. And you got to remember that Adam and Eve are one flesh, and they were naked and unashamed. Knowledge is entered into the world through Adam and Eve. A corruption has taken place through that knowledge. And as you can see, I'm working through all of this. That's why I say I wrestle with these stories. Is there's a corruption of that, and it seems like that important piece to God of that male and female, of the becoming one and a sacredness, so to speak, and then a reference to it being that there's violence. I don't know that this is necessarily violence. Violence. As in like war, physical abuse, things like that, although it could be part of that. But it seems almost like there's a sexual nature to it, that there is a corruption of being. And sexuality is a very important thing for being, especially when you're thinking of fertility cults and different things like that could possibly be influencing this time, that the Lord is grieved by this, that they are so off course. The reason I think this is because I wonder if that has to do with what goes on in the story of Noah cursing his own son. If Noah is righteous, which I wouldn't say that Noah is pure, but it seems that if you're looking at Noah in contrast to the rest of the world that he's in, and then Noah being taken by his son in his drunken state, his nakedness, it seems that would be a answer or a reason for why Noah responded in the way that he did. As I said, I'm wrestling with this, so I'm interested in any feedback you would send, or any questions that would give further thought. But different things that I've read, there's not really good satisfactory answers for me of how this works, because the world is definitely evil. And so, sometimes I wonder if the Lord is just going to. One of the things that I would say is satisfying a little bit is there is a rabbi. I should have looked him up before I recorded this episode. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but he actually says that the Lord is closing the book, so to speak, on his world, and he's opening the book on man's world. That this is a transition point, that the reason the Lord's no longer going to destroy the world is because it's no longer his to destroy, that he's giving the world over. He's closing up his attempt to control the passions of man, and he's going to let it restart, and man will be in charge then, and that introduces even one of the reasons why it's said that you can eat animals now and things like that. And so it kind of satisfies me. The reason I'm not fully satisfied with it is because I don't see that laid out in the text. I don't see that clearly articulated as a motive of God. However, one of the things, if you look at your chiasm, one of the things that I would say is a motive of God, a part of God, as I mentioned previously, that other gods and other stories, they weren't really acting within the story. They were being acted upon by chaos. That's a recurring theme within ancient stories. They're scared of the water. They're scared of the flood. The Lord seems to be in charge of everything in this. And if you kind of drill down, what seems to be the central point in this flood narrative is chapter 8. And chapter 8, Genesis 8 says, "But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark." And I think that's important to understand here, that God as the one in charge, especially when you're looking at being compared to other gods that somebody could worship, somebody could put their trust in, that the Lord is the one that's the main actor. He's doing something. And then after this episode, he actually introduces a covenant and introduces a way of escape, a way of building, so to speak, that there is this trust that you can put in God of his world, living in his way. Noah found grace. He was approved, so to speak. And that's a significant thing of God as the mover and the covenant giver, that he then makes the promise that he's no longer going to do it, and we have a symbol of that. And that's where I would introduce this idea, especially as we're going through Genesis, of this idea that I think the Lord's relationship with humans is dynamic. I think that a lot of times we think of God as static, that he doesn't act, he doesn't move. But it seems in these stories that he is dynamic, that he moves and does different things within time as it's unfolding. And so, one of those things would be the rainbow. I've sometimes asked, did the rainbow exist before the flood, or was it invented? Did God invent the rainbow as a sign to let everybody know that it's not going to happen again? He's given us a sign. And so giving that sign after the fact is a evidence of the ongoing relationship that God has with his creation as time unfolds, as events and things happen. At least that's how I read it. I think this is important, understanding these pieces here, what I've laid out in the story, that God remembered Noah. He is the main actor. That's what matters here, is the time that they get out of the boat. It's not that God wasn't afraid of the things, stuff like that, but that he remembered Noah and he's taking care of these things. He's now going to get them out. I think that's important in narrative progression. If you're thinking of going from creation of the world, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, fast forward to Noah, giving us this picture of God still being in charge, even though the world has corrupted things. God is still in charge. And then you have fast forward again of Noah to Abraham, and you have the Tower of Babel, which we'll discuss in our next episode. But you have this narrative pause where they focus in, and it gives you this story necessary for for the background, the history leading into Abraham. And if I'm asking the question of what is the importance of that history, what is the importance of that background, it's that the Lord, even in the things that are out of control, violence, those kinds of things, I think that it's significant over and over and over, even since the creation story, that God is very different from his reasons for things, and his activity within is very different from these other creation and other religious texts that we have, even the flood narratives. I think that's something to take away from the story. So hopefully you had some fun finding that chiasm and focusing in on that point. Like I said, I believe that's the point. And so let me know what your thoughts are, feedback, any kind of questions you have. You can leave them on the podcast itself, depending on what platform you're watching on, or you can send me a message through social media. I would love to hear from you.